Morning. It's John Lawless here with CareWorx. Thanks for attending the Masterclass Part 5, Cloud Security Concerns All Businesses Should Be Aware of. I'm here with Jason Murphy, and we'll be taking you through some of the pros and cons of cloud versus on-premise security. Just some housekeeping. If you have questions, raise your hand or use the tool to ask the questions, and we'll try to keep an eye out for them and respond to them as quickly as we can. And otherwise, hopefully this will be around half hour to 40 minutes worth of information. And when you're at the end of it, you'll take some things away that maybe you hadn't thought of before that can help you in your journey towards whether you're moving or staying put on an on-premise solution.
Yeah, and for those who are online, if you could just give us a quick message to make sure that you can hear us okay. I always want to be sure that that the people listening in can actually hear us. So if you could please just send us a quick chat message using your GoToWebinar chat, just letting us know that that you can hear us okay.
So
we're good.
Good? Okay. All's well for us in Montreal. Okay, so what's on the screen here? So from an agenda standpoint, as I said, we'll introduce Jason and myself in a little more detail. We're going to go over the pros and cons of both cloud-based security and on-premise security. We'll talk about some of the data privacy issues and the backup considerations when you're selecting a cloud infrastructure, and then the key factors in selecting a cloud host if you decide you're going to go into the cloud. And most businesses these days have some form of cloud type of infrastructure, but we'll talk about things you need to look out for when you're looking at where to put your data or your applications. So the voice you're hearing right now, I'm Jonathan Lawless, Director of VCIO Services for CareWorx. I've been in the IT and the IT managed services industry for, unfortunately, about 20 years now. My role with CareWorx is working with clients on a strategic level, from advising them on things like this to whether they're going to the cloud, whether they're going to stay on premise, their security and compliance issues, and just general strategy, budgeting, road mapping, and things like that from their IT standpoint.
Yeah, and obviously you can see on the screen, my name is Jason Murphy. I'm the Director of Sales Engineering here at CareWorx. I'm involved in a few aspects of our business. So not only do I assist our non-technical sales team, much like Jonathan does from a kind of a support and strategy point of view, but I also tailor solutions to our customers. I give them the pros and cons of using things like cloud services, and we'll kind of steer our customers into the right solution that best fits them based on many factors. Primarily, one is budget, but also is kind of their landscape in terms of who they're trying to offer services to and their business. And Jonathan really kind of steers that conversation mostly. I'll typically come in and help around the solutions portion of that.
And further on the housekeeping front, we'll give you an idea of who CareWorx is. If you've been on these webinars before, you've seen some of these slides already, but we are a top 40 global managed service provider. We have approximately 60,000 devices in use, 4,400 facilities managed, and about 500 service tickets or 500,000 service tickets annually. So we're a large-scale managed service provider that deals with organizations anywhere from 10 to 15 users all the way up to several hundred users, and we provide a range of services for those clients that spans from managed, what we'll call our managed ITSM platform, which is a flavor of ServiceNow, which is an automation around service ticketing and IT automation. We have our 24/7 service desk, which offers everything from level 1 triage type support all the way up to becoming a full support help desk for your IT needs. Jason, maybe you can talk to the monitoring and automation side.
Sure, that's my bread and butter. So I'm primarily responsible for the monitoring and automation, and some of the security. We kind of do that in tandem. But the monitoring and automation piece is how CareWorx delivers value to our customers, primarily around keeping systems up and running and healthy all of the time, providing things like visibility into your IT assets. Monitoring in 2018 is very different than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. People need to see, or businesses need to see, things like IT assets, what they're doing, what applications are installed, what patches are installed, the health of the device, and also, things like asset information. And that really ties back into that first pillar, as we call it, managed ITSM. So what we do is we deliver all of that rich asset information into an IT service management system so that we can really track it and run reports and get the real visibility. Just to touch on the security, and if you've listened to any of the previous 4 master classes, I did, I believe, 1, 2, and 4, if I remember correctly. But my last one, I kind of touched on AV and patch management. Those are the 2 that I train our staff here on. I try to deliver as much value as I can around kind of that layered security approach that we bring to the table here at CareWorx.
So to getting started on down the road here, I think it's very important that we define what is on-premise and what is cloud when it comes to infrastructure. Obviously, for an on-premise side of things, typically what we look at is technology that's located within your organization or the physical confines of the building. So sometimes you'll see this as a server room that's on the main floor. Sometimes you'll see it as in some small businesses, it's a closet that they've repurposed to become an IT closet where they have their servers, their switching, their telephony, where the internet connection comes in. Essentially, it's on-premise is when you have physical access to your devices. So I'd like to add into that organizations that have even co-located equipment at a hosting facility. Typically, that's not public accessed. It's a private connection to that equipment, and that would be your equipment under your control with your physical access. So that would be what I'd call on-premise. The cloud would be the virtualized infrastructure. So someone is hosting the hardware and the equipment that it takes to deliver the services that you're looking for, whether that's software as a service or infrastructure as a service. But it's somewhere outside of your typical control. You may have physical access to it, but it would be limited physical access, and really you're only accessing a server farm as opposed to your own equipment.
Yeah, and just to kind of expand a little more, I think we all have a good concept of what on-premise IT is. Cloud IT can be many, many forms, right? They kind of take on a life of their own based on the vendor you're doing business with. There's 3 kind of typical cloud strategies. Private cloud is typically where you have what you were describing. It's like someone else's data center, right? You're putting your on-premise assets in their kind of their facility. For example, like Rogers, or Bell. You might have physical access, but that's really kind of someone else's, IT, data center. So you've got your private cloud, and then you've got your public cloud, which we all hear about. Not a huge fan. So it's one of those things where I make everybody know my thoughts around kind of public cloud vendors, and there's reasons why. I mean, if you're from a security landscape perspective, looking to access other people's information, are you going to do that on a kind of a smaller scale in like an Ottawa-based data center, or are you trying to hit up like AWS, right? So
yeah.
There are, AWS is very cost effective, but when you read about the latest data breaches, typically those are in someone else's public cloud.
So this is one of the reasons why Jason and I are doing this together. Is I think we're differing opinions on a lot of this.
Yeah, we don't always agree.
No.
It's one of those things where when you've got private cloud and public cloud, then you get into what is called hybrid cloud, right? So when you're talking about putting applications in maybe Azure, for example, right? You can do both, right? You can have some things kind of local to, like a Rogers, for example. I'm picking on Rogers today, but whether it's Bell or Rackspace or other providers, you can have both, right? And you can really create redundancy and kind of a more hybrid strategy around your.
And I think today most organizations have some form of a hybrid infrastructure. So whether their domain or their files are internal, but they use a hosted email solution, or they're using a cloud-based solution like a Salesforce or one of the financial management applications is a hosted application. That would typically be considered a hybrid.
Right, of course. And it's one of those things where nobody's getting away from cloud in 2018. I mean, we're all typically using Office 365. And if you're not, you should be talking to us after this call. But it's one of those things where we're all using cloud in some form, and just there's varying levels.
Yeah, and so we wanted to document what the sort of the good, the bad are, for the good and the bad for both the on-premise and the cloud.
So you're doing the good and I'm doing the bad.
Yeah, we can do that. From an on-premise standpoint, the good is sort of what Jason started to allude to, is you do have full control over everything. So you get to choose and you get to select your perimeter security, your hardware devices, your firewalls, what servers you're going to run. You get to decide how you're going to administrate your data, who has access to what, physical access and logical access to everything. And as Jason was saying, you have limited exposure to attack. So you are one IP address or a small group of IP addresses, and you are a small company in your own little pigeonhole of the internet. You're not exposed to a wider threat of attacks for someone looking to just do damage in general.
And there are some positives to being on premise, right? You know, as you can see the list in front of you. But the other aspect is that you can really, from an on-premise strategy, really start picking and choosing what then gets moved. We call this the IT transformation. Right, you can start getting into those hybrid aspects, right?
Yeah.
Well, my accounting platform. Okay, I'm going to put QuickBooks through QuickBooks Cloud, or what have you. You can pick and choose what moves and how fast based on your budget and everything else.
Yeah, and as I said, you have physical access to your resources, which is good and bad. It's good for the most part. In the event that something is major, something has failed, something is going wrong, you can quickly go in and physically access it without needing to go get a retinal scan at some building that's 14 miles away or in another city.
Well, and the one thing I can chime in really quick is that there's also a good cost to this as well, right? If you're making that capital investment over, say, a 5-year period, right? And then you start looking at the cost of, say, a public cloud provider. Like if you're looking to take, on premise and then put in the cloud, look at those costs. Look at the total cost of ownership, right? They're almost similar, right? Microsoft's in business not to lose money, right? So, and they're also very competitive. So it's one of those things where, we also help our customers with that kind of piece, that due diligence in terms of what the costs really are. But, let's be honest. And we'll get into.
Yeah, we're about to get into the cost as a negative.
Right, but yeah. There are benefits to using on-premise infrastructure. I like applications in the cloud.
Yes.
Obviously, servers are hosting applications or web services or what have you. But there are reasons to have, some on-premise infrastructure as well.
For sure. In terms of, so we'll call it the cons or the negatives that come towards the on-premise infrastructure, you'll notice that the first point is listed on the last screen as a plus. Well, it can also be a bit of a negative. It's a double-edged sword in that, while it's good to have control over everything, there's significant challenges that come along with this. So you now become responsible for securing all of that infrastructure that you keep in your office. So this means that internally, you're going to need a deeper understanding of security across a much wider spectrum. So it can be expensive to DIY a complete security for your IT environment. There's cost of hardware, cost of software, cost of different tools. There's the cost and effort for systems required to perform updates, upgrades, patching, configuration changes, change management, and things that you may not want to get into as an organization. If it's not your skill set, it can be somewhat daunting, and to hire those resources or outsource those resources can be very expensive. So people with the required knowledge and skills to architect or implement and maintain that type of security environment can be somewhat pricey.
Well, there are some hidden costs to maintaining on-premise equipment, right? Like somebody has to go in and once upon a time, I would say when I was a system administrator, probably back in 2004 or 5, I had no problem as a young man staying up and re-architecting that spaghetti mess that you see in front of you at 3 o'clock in the morning and recabling it. But that comes with a cost, right? You have to pay people to do that. And that's one of the things that we're in anyone's cloud, that's someone else's problem, right?
Yeah. And the last one on the list there, which is kind of an interesting one, and it affects everything, not just on-premise, but it's an on-premise, it's a cloud, it's a universal IT issue, which is the what's widely becoming known now as shadow IT. So when people in an organization are having trouble getting to or being able to do what they want to do or the way they want to do it, they sometimes will go outside of your typical box, and they'll figure out a way to do it that you're not aware of. So whether that's a freeware software, or whether that's bringing in a USB device because it has something on it that they wanted to bring onto their machine, is something we call shadow IT. So it's stuff outside of a typical IT control. It's listed here as a negative on the on-premise side. It's a negative everywhere we go. It's just a little bit different on the cloud infrastructure side of things.
Well, right, and I mean, we have probably close to 150 technicians at this point. We see shadow IT day in, day out. We kind of live it, only because, hey, we're used to troubleshooting, and we all have our sets and flavors of the tool sets that we use to kind of help our customers. So it's one of those things that, from an internal perspective, we kind of wag the finger and tell people what to do and what not to do. But when it comes to our customers especially, it's one of those things where we have our own tool set. So we standardize, right, as a managed service provider. So there's a lot of peace of mind that, you know, a junior technician, for example, isn't going into your sophisticated equipment and downloading, you know, either a freeware tool or what have you. And those are one of the benefits of maintaining a on-premise infrastructure with an MSP.
The hard part on that, from an on-premise side, when it comes to shadow IT, is, you know, if someone downloads and installs a license, it's not as easy to detect when it's, you know, you have a wide organization to manage, monitor, and keep track of. So it's just something to be aware of, is that in terms of threats moving forward.
For sure.
The good side of the cloud, you get to offload all that infrastructure and the security, all the infrastructure and security related to CSP, the cloud service provider. So you're getting the benefits of enterprise grade hardware if you select the right vendor. You're getting the world-class tools for intrusion detection and prevention. You're getting people whose only responsibility it is to watch and make sure that the security is being maintained and that things are happening the way they're supposed to. So you end up responsible for managing SLAs and expectations from the service provider and the specific security requirements. And the provider gets to take on the perimeter security itself.
Mind if I steal number 3 here?
Yeah,
or number 2, I guess we'll
Absolutely.
call it. And it's one of those things that one of the major issues we see with our customers is the fact that when you have on-premise infrastructure, what happens is, and I guess I am doing a little bit of the bad here, but it's one of those things where password resets, as simple as those are often very, very difficult when you have on-premise systems, right? You can get yourself locked out. Even as an administrator, you can lock yourselves out. Where when you have true SaaS-based applications, you know, these applications that are running in the cloud, it's one of those things where very, very easy to maintain, you know, kind of identity and access, you know, through those tool sets.
Yeah, and when you have a larger provider, we'll just use AWS or Google as an example. Their entire infrastructure is built on a multi-tenant model, which means they have to put a significant investment and a significant technology into making sure that they can control access and management to every single aspect of the system. So you're gaining an enterprise level tool on that side as well. From a disaster recovery or DR, you can't beat the cloud, really. The amount of redundancies that are built in, the amount of infrastructure that's put aside for you to make sure that if something's offline somewhere, you can bring it back up online somewhere else. It's hard to do that from your own infrastructure standpoint.
I mean, we do a good clip of business with Microsoft Azure. It's one of those things when we have a customer who wants to, you know, start their IT transformation and start putting, you know, servers or applications in the cloud. When you start looking at, you know, disaster recovery, you can really pick and choose what that really looks like. And again, that's one of the hidden costs of on-premise, right? I mean, when you're looking at that total cost of ownership, there are a lot of factors that I mean, they're not just pound for pound in terms of application and server and everything else. There's disaster recovery, the labor involved, and the patching, and all of that goes along with that on-premise. Whereas disaster recovery is built in. You're making DR someone else's problem, right? And you're also doing that through typically an OpEx model, right, John? I mean, it's one of those things where you're paying that monthly subscription for QuickBooks, or, you know, I'll use that as an example. But they're the ones who are now responsible for the integrity of your data.
You're holding them accountable for making sure that it's there when you need it.
Right, and at least with Azure, you can pick and choose the frequency, the RTO and RPO, which we'll talk about a little bit later, around kind of disaster recovery. What happens if, their server goes offline?
Yeah, and why is that a security related issue? Well, from a standpoint of, let's say you're attacked or there's a ransomware attack, you need to be able to go back and restore, or you need to be able to use completely different infrastructure that hasn't been attacked or breached. So making that available through a monthly cost and through somebody else's problem is somewhat, I call it one of the positives of the cloud side.
That's it.
And the automation. So the automation to me is one of the most important sides from a security standpoint in the cloud. Reports and analysis are run at the same time. They're looking for consistent and well-defined threats. These are automated tools that are set to scan your environment based on a baseline and looking for anything that's going to change. So not only is it faster and more efficient, which during a breach or an attack is obviously critical, but it improves accuracy. So it means no threats are being missed due to human error. People aren't looking at log files and then wondering if that might be an issue or not. These things are set to look for very specific anomalies or very specific changes within the log or within the infrastructure, and then do something about it immediately. So it can really drastically speed up response time and accuracy. So you're under a bit more protection when it comes to an automated security scanning or automated security tool that you're not going to get when you're on premise unless you're going to pay for it and maintain it yourself.
And the other part of that is that you're typically in any kind of cloud like Azure or AWS or some of the larger ones, you're getting to more distributed environments, right?
Absolutely.
You're not just running containers, right?
Yeah.
You can run a VM in Microsoft Azure, but when you want to run a database application, you're now separating what that really looks like. The database might be in Montreal one day, in Toronto the next, and really it's based on the redundancy and kind of geolocation and everything else that goes along with that. So it's one of those things where, in terms of a security landscape perspective, it can really mitigate your risk.
Yeah. So you become responsible for securing your data. So whether that's an application, then you get to decide exactly how you're going to provide access, what you're going to do with encryption, what's going to reside where within the application. That's your problem, but the perimeter security and the maintenance of access to that infrastructure is no longer your issue. So you can focus down a little bit more. So that's a good thing from the cloud side of things. On the negative side of the cloud,
here we go.
The opposite of what the on-premise was. You are now part of a wider threat landscape, meaning there are people out there looking to take down Amazon. If you're on Amazon, you're going to be part of that disaster, as opposed to someone who's looking to take down your small little niche, within the internet. So you're exposed to more things. You're a client of a large cloud provider, so you're no longer isolated. Attackers are, DDoS attacks that are trying to take down large groups indiscriminately, just trying to take down as many as they can. Things that I call cross-pollination attempts. So get in somewhere and try to get across to multi-tenancy. I'll be honest, I don't think there's been any reported incidents of that in the major providers, but it's definitely a threat. And I think that cross-pollination is my term. I don't think that's an official term.
Well, when you start looking at S3 buckets, so inherently, and again, I'll do a bit of the bad here when it comes to the cloud, but it's one of those things where if you read about security breaches, typically it's not because inherently the cloud is unsecure.
No.
But what happens is somebody has to pay for that service. Somebody has to fire all of that up. This isn't just point and click. You have to have a proper training to properly secure AWS or Azure, right?
Absolutely.
You don't go in there as a office administrator and start, architecting all of this. You still need people who have that kind of experience. So what happens is when you read about data breaches, I won't get into any specifics, but there is one where there was around 300 million voting records taken out of AWS. And it wasn't inherently because AWS was vulnerable. It's because somebody left something open, right? So you really have to understand the cloud infrastructure you're using and how to properly secure your data.
That's exactly right. So it comes down to this, and this is defined, I think, by the Canadian Privacy Commissioner as well, as you are responsible for your data no matter where it resides. So if you decide to put it with a host, it's still your responsibility to make sure that the access to that data and whoever is accessing it and how they're using it is under control, and it's your responsibility. So AWS, I'll stop using them as an example, but the large cloud providers, they're going to protect their infrastructure and where your stuff resides. It's still your responsibility to make sure that it's secure. And I think that's where some people fall down, as they think, oh, it's in the cloud. It's, there we go, wipe my hands. Now it's not my problem. And the data is still your problem. Their make sure that their job is to make sure that it's not breached, or they're up at all times. There's no attacks on them from a denial of service standpoint, but for the most part, you're still responsible for your data.
And that's really coming back to, I think, your second or third slide around IaaS or PaaS, right?
Yeah.
Like you're getting into infrastructure as a service. You're using Microsoft's infrastructure and how it's been all architected through the web-based portal that they give you, or the platform itself, right? So you're still responsible for putting all of that together, right? They're not doing it for you.
And I think the next one there, the Internet Accessible APIs. So cloud providers expose a set of application programming interfaces, or APIs, that customers use to manage and interact with their cloud services. So also known as their management plane. So the tools that you use to actually decide where your data is going and what's going to go where. So organizations use them to provision and manage and monitor their own assets and their users, but threat actors or the attackers like to look for vulnerabilities in these APIs because they're the ones exposed to the internet. So if they're discovered, the vulnerabilities can be turned into pretty successful attacks, and I think that's when you see the larger attacks. They're coming through the APIs, and organizations' cloud assets can be compromised. So, using those APIs against you, they're the way you manage your data, but they can be used against you as well. Most of the larger providers have those locked down, but they're always the attackers are always looking for a way in, and that's their usual way in. And that falls down to the similar idea of the multi-tenant. So, exploitation of systems and software vulnerabilities within that infrastructure. It can lead to failure and the problem failure of maintaining that separation between clients. As I said, I don't think there's been any known reports of this happening, but it's definitely something that exploiters and the attackers are looking for as a way to get in somewhere and then get across these virtual infrastructures to as many companies as they can. One that was probably not talked about so much, and I think it's becoming more important today with the new compliance issues, is the incomplete data destruction or deletion of your data. So as Jason was saying earlier, your data is now spread across all kinds of different systems, potentially different data centers, different servers, different hard drives.
Could be different countries.
Could be different countries. And so in that multi-tenancy type environment or multi-infrastructure environment, deleting that data can be really challenging, and proving that data has been destroyed from a compliance standpoint can be very challenging. So it's something definitely to keep in mind when you're looking at moving to the cloud, is how sensitive is your data, what are your retention requirements, and what deletion requirements do you have, or destruction requirements do you have, and what type of proof can the cloud provider give you or help you with in terms of being able to document that deletion of data.
Yeah, and if you were on any of my previous webinars or master classes, I always include a slide around security versus risk, right? Because if you're in the medical profession, for example, your data is much more sensitive than, say, a retail outlet or a pizzeria, right? So you really need to evaluate what is sensitive, right? And obviously make a judgment call based on that.
Yeah, and then there's the compliance issues, with compliance being the big buzzword that I have to deal with and hear about in almost every conversation these days. We'll address a little bit more, I think, actually in the next slide, but it's important to understand, as Jason was just saying, what type of data do you hold? What are your compliance requirements around that data? What are even further than that, let's say it's not even a legal compliance, but you have certain clients that are dictating a certain way they want their data handled. You need to understand that before placing it with a third-party host. And on that note, the dry stuff that tends to put most people to sleep, but is where I live most of my days, is on the privacy side of things. So
this is where you and I are very different.
Yeah. So there's a few things on here. So data travels more frequently across the internet when you're using a cloud service provider. Obviously, you can store, you're sending things from your laptop to your server and it's in the closet down the hall. It's not hitting anything public. When you're sending your data to a web host or a hosted application, that data is now on a public infrastructure. So protecting that sensitive data in transit is imperative for modern organizations. Attackers are looking for, that's one of the ways they're looking to find new ways to compromise systems and steal that data as it transfers between one machine to the other. So obviously this is where encryption would come in. Typically when you're transmitting data to a cloud host, you like to use a VPN, some sort of VPN, even if it's a simple HTTPS or SSL type VPN. Remember that, and remember when you're looking for that cloud service provider, understand the ways that they can accept, the ways they can connect to you, and how you can encrypt that data both at rest when it's on their systems, but in transit between you and that provider itself.
Awesome.
Yeah, the multiple customers. So we touched on that a few minutes ago. Your data is residing on the same machines technically as other organizations' data. In most cases, that's irrelevant. In some cases, like secure or top secret data that's government secured or healthcare provider data, there may be requirements around that say you are not to host it with a third-party solution. That data needs to reside in your control at all times. And the processing of that data can't be outsourced. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Well, and as a North American, actually, we're global, but I mean, it's mostly North America, is that a lot of our Canadian customers have severe privacy concerns around where their data is, yes. Right? And in most cases, I mean, at least in 2018, we can control a lot of that now. You know, historically, for example, Office 365 for many years could not guarantee you that your data was going to be in Canada. Yeah. That's only been an advent, I would say, in the last couple of years. Yes. So it's always a consideration when you're looking at
sure.
You know, your cloud provider, but also the guarantees they can give you.
Yeah, and I'll think. I mean, kind of. I wasn't intending to talk about this, but the data in transit piece, where you're talking about your data going between either yourself and the cloud service provider, or the cloud service provider's data centers from a backup standpoint or a redundancy standpoint. How is that data traveling? Is it crossing international boundaries? Is it going from one router in Toronto to a router in Buffalo to out to Calgary, or is it going straight down the Canadian side of things? You can pay the premium service providers to ensure that your data never leaves, even in transit. But for the most part, if you don't say so, you don't really have control over where it travels. Is that important? To most people, absolutely not. Completely irrelevant. To some, it's important. So it's important if you're moving to the cloud and you deal with sensitive data to understand how that data travels. And that gets after the multiple customers would become that function creep, which is something that's a little bit new as well. And I think was exposed pretty nicely by Facebook there not that long ago in terms of these cloud service providers using your cloud hosted data in ways that you did not anticipate and may not have thought you approved. So if you're storing your data with someone on the cloud, what are they doing with it? Is it yours? Is it theirs? Do they have access? Can they share it? It's something that's important to make sure that you're aware of, and that the contract that you sign in the SLA doesn't permit them to do anything with your data, your stats, your metadata, if you don't want them to.
Right, and that's where it gets a little creepy, we'll call it. Yeah. You know, with the whole Facebook issue that occurred, you know, this year. It's one of those things where, you know, these people were signing agreements. However, they engineered their own strategies around that data, right? And then sold that data, for example. So, you know, we won't get into, you know, obviously social media and on that tangent, but, you know, when we're talking about putting your data in the cloud, you have to have a really, really good understanding of how APIs work and what can be accessed.
Yeah,
and who can access it.
For sure, and that comes down to, I mean, we don't want to spend a lot of time on PIPEDA or PIPEDA as people see it, the Personal Identification Protection and Electronic Document Act, which is now very prominent in Canada.
Well, Jonathan, let me ask you, you're a bit of a guru in privacy. It's one of those things that, you know, obviously, for those who don't know, PIPEDA actually changed recently, yes. November 1.
Yeah.
You know, what are some of the kind of the changes? I know,
yeah.
High level. I mean,
sure.
We want to deep dive.
The most sort of impactful would be the requirement for reporting. So identifying and reporting breaches, if anything, or breaches or attacks, anything that's breached, any data that's breached, anytime your organization's been attacked, you need to report that to the proper authorities within a certain amount of time. And there's a certain specific amount of detail that needs to be within that report. So it's now holding you to a standard where you're going to need to make sure that the tools and the infrastructure you have in place can provide the information that's needed within a timely basis. So you're going to need to say, you know what, somebody got in and they were able to access this type of information. This is what they did with it. This is how long they had access. This is where we think it could have gone. And this is what we did to prevent it. And you have to provide that type of report to Privacy Commission. Right. So it's important to do so, or there's fines and penalties attached.
So as someone who also dives into things like GDPR, where is PIPEDA today? I mean, it's better than it was yesterday, or I should say, you know, October 30th or 31st. But is it really? I mean, in Canada, and I have my own particular views, but you spend a lot more time in privacy than I do. So it's one of those things that, is it sufficient to follow that? what would you recommend to customers in terms of PIPEDA or other regulations?
Be very aware of, again, it comes down to knowing your risk factors, knowing your organization, and then being aware of how PIPEDA applies to you. PIPEDA is getting better. It's basing, and one of the reasons for the change is the GDPR that you mentioned. And GDPR is a much broader and a lot more, it takes into account a lot more ways that information is handled than PIPEDA does. And PIPEDA is trying to, and I think there's going to be even another major change to try to reflect across North America something very similar to the GDPR requirements in terms of data processing and the access to data that's being processed. But PIPEDA today is actually, I'll say it's a needed standard that we just, the main thing being, make sure you understand what the impact is to your organization, because right now you could get blindsided and the fines can take you out of business.
Right. And if I'm doing a little bit of the bad here, I would say that, Canada is really playing catch up at this point.
We're ahead of a lot of countries. We're behind Europe.
Yeah, and the U.S., for example, doesn't really have their own gold standard either.
So they're going to come out with GDPR labeled differently,
right?
And it's going to take into account a little bit of the PIPEDA and GDPR and make it their own.
Right. I mean, one of the standards that I always purported previously was HIPAA, right?
Yeah.
I mean, HIPAA is a really good framework around data security. So governments, or whether you're following PIPEDA or whether you're following US CERT or GDPR or what have you, as long as you're following something and adhering to it.
And most the two standards, the PIPEDA and GDPR right now, if you read the sort of the way they start out, is you don't need to be perfect, but you need to have something in place and you need to show that you're moving towards getting better all the time. So it can't just be we threw up a policy. It has to be a requirement towards getting better information and knowledge towards your security.
Right, and from something that I see is that small, medium businesses really don't have a defined security policy.
No,
right?
Most don't.
Right, I mean, not to steal your thunder or anything, but I mean, it's one of those things that, that's what you do.
Yeah.
You define that with our customers. So
unfortunately, unfortunately, those policies and procedures used to be enterprise based, and now it's trickled down, and small organizations need to have it.
Right, exactly.
The backup and disaster recovery we touched on the disaster recovery side of things, so I think we'll look more on the backup side. And when we say backup in the cloud, we're not talking about taking your information and backing up to the cloud. It's more along the lines of if you have a cloud-based infrastructure, making sure that you back up that data, or that your provider is backing up that data. And again, it comes down to understanding what type of data you have, the regulations that apply, and things like how long do you need to keep it, how fast do you need to be able to access it, how long do you have to keep it before you have to destroy it, and then how long are you allowed to keep it before destroying it. And there's a big difference there. We have some clients who have a must keep it for 7, must not keep it for more than 10 type of situation. So they have to go in and destroy that data. And is that possible in the cloud?
Right. And let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
I mean, we all use Gmail or some kind of web-based email. Do we have, because I don't even know the answer, to be honest with you, but do we have an answer for what happens if Google loses your email? Right?
Yeah.
I'm sure they have, and I'm pretty confident Google has redundancy in place around my email. But what if they didn't, right? Like, what is their policy around data loss?
Yeah.
Do they give me any guarantees?
Nope.
I don't know. But if we're talking about your business, right, you definitely want to have some answers around what happens if you lose data. For example, Microsoft will give you 30 days. Of Office 365 data retention. 30 days, that's it. So if you need to go back 6 months to get an email
that you accidentally deleted,
you better have an answer for that, right? I mean, and it's one of those things that we use a particular tool called Backupify for backing up Office 365 infinitely. So it's one of those things. Well, I shouldn't say infinitely, but you get what I mean.
You can, yeah.
But you can keep it for up to 5 to 7 years. It's one of those things where people aren't asking themselves the right questions, right? Because they're going, oh, now that I put this application in the cloud, I'm good.
That's right.
You just expect them to give you data retention. That's not always the case.
That's right. And that's the last point here, is who's responsible for backing up and restoring the data. So understand that when you put data somewhere, who's responsible to make sure that it's kept, or that there's a backup copy of it and something that you can go back to if in case there was an error or a problem, an attack, and see, and pull that data back. Is it yours or is it the cloud providers? Mm-hmm. Make sure you're aware of it and make sure that it's documented and that you understand what their responsibilities are. And on that note, we'll look at collect. So how do we select a cloud provider? What are the key points that we need to look at? Obviously,
before you go into this, let me ask you a really quick question. If you had a business with 30 employees and I want to take all of my physical infrastructure, what would you tell that customer?
30 employees, physical infrastructure? Yeah. Again, what do they do? It comes down to more along those lines.
Not to put you on the spot.
No. My instinct is if there's no compliance reasons not to, and there's nothing complex that needs to reside in-house, I'm typically looking to the cloud would be my first option, and I'd have to rule it out as opposed to looking to stay in-house and rule it out.
There you go. Yeah. So again, this is where we differ. No, it's one of those things that, I mean, everybody wants IT to be someone else's problem. Sure. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I mean, everybody looks at the labor involved. What does it cost to hire a guy or two, or a person or two, I should say? Hardware, as cheap as we think hardware is in 2018, it's still not that cheap, right? Physical infrastructure costs money. There's capital investment that has to go in, or CapEx involved. But that's where, choosing, a cloud service provider or a managed service provider like CareWorx can help really offset. Absolutely. Right?
Yeah. And when you do decide to look at a new provider, you need to understand several aspects of it, and some of them may not be as important to you, but others, some of these will definitely be important. So security, it's what we're talking about today. So it's number one on the list. How do they do it? So you want to understand precisely what your security goals are, the security measures that are offered by the provider, and then the mechanisms they use to preserve your applications and your data. So make sure you completely understand the specific areas that you're responsible for when you start using a cloud service provider. Consider what security features are offered free out of the box by that provider for each vendor that you're evaluating, and what additional paid services are available, because maybe they have something that you'd like to utilize or you'd like to leverage from them that they don't typically offer to just their base package clients.
Yeah, let me just expand on that point, because I think that's huge, right? When you're going into Azure, for example, you're just starting out, you're putting a couple VMs up there, you're transitioning your data over, and that's typically what we do with our customers as well, is that there are additional services, right? So they'll look at, the monthly recurring cost on, what does it cost to put 3 VMs in the cloud? But then there's other things to consider as well. How much data, CPU, or compute as they call it, but also disaster recovery, right? And then there's usually modes of disaster recovery that you want based on the recovery time objective, the recovery point objective. So there are additional considerations that you need to factor in, but always at least ask yourself, what happens if.
And the big providers typically make it really easy to see what they provide by default and provide additionally on their websites. You can usually click through to see the features and additional benefits type page.
For sure.
And ensure that whatever you're getting matches to what your requirements are. So, security is the top concern in the cloud for most people and pretty much everywhere these days. So ask the detailed questions and make sure you know what you're getting into. Compliance. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we just did, but make sure that the provider that you're looking at can help with your compliance issues. So if you need to be GDPR or SOC 2 or PCI compliant, make sure that the infrastructure you're about to use can maybe even push you forward toward reaching that compliance statement, as opposed to it's somewhere that doesn't have that certification, and then you're justifying it and trying to become compliant yourself.
Yeah, and you have to consider, any kind of cloud service provider a vendor, right? And these vendors have to spend money on compliance, being adhered to a certain compliance standard like SOC 2, for example. Yeah. And so, understanding and really, dotting the I's and crossing the T's when it comes to, checking off those boxes and making sure that, everyone who can access that data center has to go through a retinal scan. What is the power requirements of the data center? There's certain standards, gold standards that go along with, with data centers. So really understanding what that is.
And we talked about DR, so I don't want to go too much into it, but when you're talking about the hardware aspects built in, the auto failover, the redundancy should be built in, but you need to understand that their procedures are in place in the event of an outage to ensure that your business continuity is protected. So get them to provide you with their business continuity plan, their data breach response plan. Get them to justify to you that they have their steps in place, and then it matches with what you require from either a business or a compliance standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
If you have services that are vital to your organization, make sure the cloud provider you choose offers an easy way to integrate with them, or is comfortable porting them over to similar service that they support, so that you determine how much time and effort it'll take for your team to manage various aspects of that application within their cloud platform, so that you aren't caught off guard and realize that it's going to take a full-time staff to manage something you now thought was outsourced. What's their support like? Make sure that it's available, make sure that it's quick and simple to use their support, so that you aren't held at their hands to get something back up and running when there's an issue. And of course, the costs. So both the sticker price and the associated costs. What comes up when you grow? What comes up when you want to add applications? What comes up if you want to add an additional level of service from what used to be 8x5 to now 24x7?
Or what happens when you've done business with Microsoft and they give you a price increase?
Right. They just decide that there's a price increase. Right?
Absolutely. Out of the blue.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that, they have to factor in a lot of costs as well. So
Absolutely.
They will adjust that.
And contract flexibility. So an odd title for this one, but under Canada's private sector, the new legislation, an organization that collects personal information is accountable for the personal information, even when it's outsourced for processing to third-party providers. So if your organization collects information from people and you're hosting it, it's your responsibility to make sure that it's protected. So all businesses in Canada, regardless of size, are accountable for the personal information they collect. That's really important because sometimes you'll find that the cloud service providers will present you with a take it or leave it type contract. Here's what we do. You can use it or you can't. And you may be held to stuff that does not work with your privacy requirements. So make sure that they're either flexible or that they have a contract that aligns with what you need.
Well, and that's a really important point, is that you do need to look at the end user license agreement, what is called a EULA, or the terms of service. There's usually a warranty section within that, very wordy. Most people just click next and bypass it, or don't even look at it at all.
Yeah.
But it is the legal requirement around things like, what is that cloud provider on the hook for?
What do they do? What do you, yeah.
Right? Yeah. If they're hit with a data breach and, all of a sudden all of your customer emails, passwords, and everything else are, on the dark web, can you come back on that company?
What are they going to do in the what are they responsible for during that response, and what are you responsible for? And can you be financially compensated, or are you out of luck?
That's right.
Yeah. Sorry, I think know your risk profile. We've said this over and over again, is understand your organization. So what does that mean, understanding your organization? What do you have? What are you likely to be a threat for? If you are a publicly visible company that's involved in things that are controversial or at least top of mind, you're more than likely, in the public's eye, you're more likely a target than if you are some sort of private organization that doesn't hold that much information to people. So what's your profile and what's your organization type? Again, do an analysis of your data. What type of data do you hold? You're going to have some data that's not that secure. It's basically publicly accessible, or at least not relevant to anybody outside the organization. And you're going to have some that's either corporately private or is somebody's private data that you need to maintain. Compliance issues. Are you compliant, or are you required to be compliant with things like GDPR and things along those lines? Or will it help your client base if you are? What type of systems are you moving to the cloud? Do you have a current risk management process in place, and will it align with the cloud provider that you're using? And then how big is your user base? So, if you are, again, a small organization with a few clients, you're a lot less of a threat risk than you are if you are an AWS who has millions of people that go to them every day. So understand that, and that can help you decide whether the cloud is for you or not. So we'll wrap it up here on the next thing, where Jason and I vastly differ, but my conclusion is this: the cloud, you're exposed to a much wider spectrum of threats, but with the right provider, and you can mitigate these risks and benefit from the efficiencies it provides and some of the security that it provides. Whereas the on-premise, it does give you a much greater sense of control, but that control comes at a cost and with some responsibilities that you have to make sure you understand and are prepared to take on. And then the key basically is understanding who you are as an organization, what you're capable of, and what you want to get involved in. If you do that, you can, with some guidance or some assistance and some questions, you can make a well-informed decision as to whether the organization needs to move to a cloud-based infrastructure or not.
Awesome. John, it's been a great 5-part masterclass series here. It's come to an end.
You see a couple of links down there below that. Obviously, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada website is excellent for information on data in the cloud. as well as the InfoTech Research Group, which is what I use for a lot of my research when it comes to getting information on best practices and so on. So if you're interested, those are good websites for you. Thanks very much for taking the time with us over the last few weeks and for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Jason or myself. We'll be following up with emails and our contact information shortly.
Thanks, everybody.